Recording is on.
Okay, so this week we've got Jacob giving a paper on madness in the Phaedrus. Wait, Phaedrus? Yes.
Yeah, Phaedrus.
Yes. And then Sophia talking about quarantine and plagues. Yes? So we'll do the usual 45 minutes, a bit of a break to think, and then we'll go on to the second paper. So please go for it.
I'm starting, right?
Yes, you are starting.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. Hi everyone. I've got a handout, and it should be on the website. So please download that if you haven't already. And I'm going to speak on madness and teleological unity in Plato's Phaedrus. The paper is also on the website, by the way. Just have it up, please. What role does madness play in the Phaedrus? It has usually been assumed that to answer this question, one must first give an account of why Plato here seems uniquely to have reconciled Mania and Sophrosyne. Such is the view of Gregory Vlastos, who has argued that it is a paradox that in the Phaedrus, the ultra-rationalist Plato included Mania and Nous in the same category. While it is true that Socrates explicitly draws attention to a mutually exclusive relationship between Mania and Sophrosyne in the first speech, only to deny this in the Palinode, too great an emphasis has been put on this interpretation of madness. In fact, as this essay argues, the most important function of madness in the Phaedrus has hitherto been ignored in favor of these interpretations that try to make sense of a paradoxical relationship between Mania and Sophrosyne. This function regards how Socrates uses madness as a means of applying his theory of diaresis, and it is the aim of this essay to show that the real function of the division of madness into four is to illustrate Plato's doctrine of unity. My argument for this thesis will proceed by showing first how there is no textual evidence to suppose with Vlastos and the scholars who follow his example that the relationship between Mania and Sophrosyne is always antithetical, and that the positive depiction of Mania in the Phaedrus should consequently be considered paradoxical. Secondly, I will advance my own novel reading that Socrates' division of madness into four types is a means of showing that all types of madness share the same unity of telos, which is a notion that I propose to call teleological unity. Third, I will argue that by making the telos of madness one, Socrates is in fact applying the theory of diaresis, which involves seeing unity in plurality. On the basis of these three sections, I will conclude that the overarching theme of the Phaedrus is unity, and that the dialogue as a whole is unified. The views of the scholars who follow Vlastos in regarding the relationship between Mania and Sophrosyne as a problem that needs solving can be divided into two camps. On the one hand, Nussbaum has shown that the negative relationship between Mania and Sophrosyne presented in Socrates' first speech, the presentation that is generally found in the dialogues prior to the Phaedrus. Accordingly, Nussbaum introduces the view that Socrates' Palinode revises not only the hostile attitude towards madness in the first speech, but also the idea of madness in the dialogues earlier than the Phaedrus in general. On Nussbaum's account, the Phaedrus introduces a whole new appreciation for madness into Plato's philosophy, and Nussbaum therefore sees no problem in regarding Socrates as literally mad in the dialogue. On the other hand, we have the scholars who are skeptical of the view that Plato in the Phaedrus endorses the kind of mania that involves the loss of rational self-control, and deny or have serious doubts that Socrates is mad in a literal sense. The main argument of the proponents of this view is that Plato would, in the words of Price, cease to be Platonic if he had included possession and madness under philosophy. Instead, these scholars propose various solutions that involve either a special kind of philosophical madness, in which there is no loss of rational self-control, or denying that Socrates is mad altogether. Against these two positions, I want to raise two objections. My first objection regards the argument shared by the scholars in both camps that Plato expresses a hostile attitude to Mania in the pre-Phaedrus dialogues. At least 4 passages in the early to middle dialogues suggest a positive relationship between philosophy and madness. Number 1, in the Crito we find Socrates saying that he follows only the logos wherever it may lead him, but nevertheless states at the end of the exchange with the laws that his experience of the good argument is akin to that of the frenzied Corybantes. Number 2, in the Phaedo, Socrates says that mystics, or bacchantes, are the ones that philosophize rightly. Number 3. In the Apology, we learn that Socrates ultimately derives his crucial life event, his duty to philosophize and serve the god, from the madness of the Pythia, who pronounces Socrates the wisest man to Chaerephon. Number 4. In the Symposium, Alcibiades explicitly identifies madness and frenzy with philosophy. If the above-mentioned scholars are right about a consistently negative attitude towards mania in the early and middle dialogues, we would expect the interlocutors in these 4 passages to object to the speaker's identification of philosophy with madness. Yet in none of the above passages do the interlocutors take issue with Socrates and Alcibiades' identification of madness and philosophy. Consequently, these passages show that Plato does not express a consistently negative attitude towards the relationship between mania and philosophy in the early and middle dialogues, and that the Phaedrus, rather than revising an earlier view of the relationship between of this relationship, merely articulates it explicitly. Therefore, we cannot accept the thesis of Nussbaum. My second objection regards the scholars in the second group who deny the possibility that Socrates is mad in a literal sense. The following passages show that Socrates does actually see himself as mad, and I will argue that the kind of mania that Socrates experiences is the literal possession of a god that involves short-term memory loss and temporary loss of intellectual autonomy. First, after having received the daimonion that tells him not to cross the river, Socrates calls himself a mantis, which is a word that he, through the cognate mantikos, links etymologically with the word manikos. Moreover, Socrates shows signs of forgetfulness, as when he suddenly asks where Phaedrus is, and assumes the identity of the poet Stesichorus. But more importantly, Socrates says after his second speech that he cannot quite remember what he has said because he was so possessed by the god. This is text 1 on the handout, where it says, but now tell me this, I can't remember it all because I was so completely possessed by the god. Did I define love at the beginning of my speech? The phrase dia to enthusiastikon has to mean possession because, as Dodds explains, the cognate word entheos means that the person literally has a theos in him. As it happens, Eros is indeed here identified as a theos rather than as a daimon, which is how the Symposium identifies him. And the madness of love is described as a kind of possession by a god. It is even possible to establish that Eros is the god that possessed Socrates in the second speech. For it would make sense that the same god who sent a divine sign to tell Socrates to correct the impiety of his first speech would also be the one to inspire Socrates actually to do so in the second speech. Indeed, Socrates does make a direct address to Eros after his second speech, which suggests that this is the god that the palinode is meant to appease. I conclude then that Socrates in his second speech believes that he is literally possessed by the god Eros to the point where he suffers from partial short-term memory loss. Consequently, it would be wrong to explain the possession away completely, as the scholars mentioned above, except Nussbaum, have done. Since I therefore think that Socrates endorses mania in the literal sense that implies temporary loss of self-control, but nevertheless do not accept the argument of Nussbaum that this is an idea particular to the Phaedrus, I must now clarify how I make sense of the relationship between mania and sophrosyne. I actually cannot see any textual evidence to suggest that there is any real tension between madness and intellectual autonomy here. Socrates does not take his possession and consequent loss of memory to mean that his sophrosyne was undermined. The philosophical value of his speech, Socrates does not take his possession and consequent loss of memory to mean that because his sophrosyne was undermined, the philosophical value of his speech is nullified. On the contrary, Socrates invites Phaedrus to help him remember his own and Lysias' speech in the ensuing portion of the dialogue, where he engages dialectically with the speeches and tells us how we should respond to his inspiration. Thus, temporary loss of self-control and memory do not seem to constitute a dilemma for the philosopher, since he can engage in anamnesis to remember what he was inspired to say. But even if we suppose that Socrates' intellectual autonomy was completely undermined, and he had no memory left of the things he discovered in his possessed state, what would be the worst that could happen? Socrates is explicitly saying that a temporary suspension of rational self-control cannot be damaging as long as it is a god who is pulling the strings. And since Eros, qua god, is good, Eros cannot cause Socrates any harm. Therefore, we must assume that Plato thought divine madness never in itself causes any harm, and divination is indeed in the Timaeus presented as a gift to humans that leads them to recollect an inspired truth. Thus, far from a paradoxical or antithetical relationship between mania and sophrosyne, I find that the two concepts are fully compatible in the dialogues, but represent different aspects of the same process of understanding. The inspiration of madness hints at a divine truth that it is the philosopher's subsequent task to recollect. On this account, I conclude that it is wrong to regard mania and sophrosyne as antithetical. So if it is not, as Nussbaum argues, to propose a new way of looking at madness in philosophy, or to clarify the relationship between mania and sophrosyne, what role should we say that mania plays in the Phaedrus? I want now to turn to the second section of this essay, where I will show that mania has been carefully chosen by Plato to illustrate his theory of diaresis, that is, division, because madness is a great example of something that has many different types that all nevertheless share a single telos of aiding man in his recollection of the divine truths that his soul was shown prior to embodiment. Let us begin with two problems. Since it is the case, as was argued above, that both the Timaeus and the Phaedrus describe divine madness as a gift to humans and the source of the greatest goods, how can we explain that Socrates feels compelled to divide divine madness into four types and make some types inferior to others, when they all provide such goods? Moreover, how can it be that Socrates ranks the lives of the prophets, priests, and poets so low in his hierarchy of lives, behind such men as the personal trainer and the businessman, when the former provides such great goods to man? In regard to both questions, it is clear that we cannot discriminate against the different types of madness and the practitioners on the basis of the kind of benefit they bestow upon man. For we just noted that madness as such makes us acquire knowledge of the divine, which it is the task of philosophy to use to improve our souls. Thus, the acquisition of knowledge of the divine can be described as the end goal of all the different human practices in which madness is involved. Therefore, since the telos is seemingly the one thing that is shared equally by all the different types of madness, it cannot be this telos that is the criterion for there being some types of madness that are inferior to others. Instead, I propose that the answer to why Socrates makes some types of madness inferior to others lies in their different ability to improve the individual soul. The first three types of madness, mantic, telestic, and poetic, differ from the madness of love in that they are all used collectively to give benefits to people other than the mad subject herself. Thus, the Pythia and the priestess at Dodona pronounce their oracles to benefit other individuals or all of Greece, whereas they themselves do not benefit due to their madness. Similarly, telestic madness presents itself as the relief in the face of the greatest collective disasters that hit mankind, and poetic madness teaches the future generations the deeds of the past. It is said of both the prophets and the poets that they are not in control of themselves when they are mad, and their service is consequently only because in anamnesis to improve their own souls with their inspiration. The madness of love, on the other hand, can benefit the individual as well as the community, insofar as it is directed at the right telos, and therefore it is the best kind of possession that a human can experience. The myth of the chariot shows us how destructive to the harmony of the soul it is when the dark horse, due to sexual excitement, disrupts the job of the charioteer, the personification of intelligence, and seeks earthly beauty rather than true beauty as its goal. Accordingly, the soul that loves rightly enslaves its appetitive part and directs itself towards true beauty to get a rapturous recollection of the divine forms that it saw when it was with Zeus. In contrast to the other three types of madness, the mad lover experiences a strong subjective experience in which he through the boy has vivid visions of the image of beauty. However, not only the lover benefits from the erotic encounter, since the image of beauty that went into the lover's eyes also streams into the eyes of the beloved, whose soul it reaches to initiate the growing of wings. Thus, the madness of love is unique among the types of madness in that it contains an ideal synthesis between individual and collective improvement of the soul, whereby both lover and beloved are moved to engage in recollection together. We may use this distinction between collective and individual improvement of the soul to answer the two problems that were outlined above about the ranking of madness and the lives of its practitioners. Socrates has made the first three types of madness inferior to erotic madness, not because mantic, telestic, and poetic madness have a different telos than erotic madness. All types of madness lead to the greatest of goods, and there is no distinction between them in this regard. Instead, the distinction that Socrates draws illustrates that the practitioners of the three inferior kinds of madness are not concerned with the improvement of their own souls, but are only of use insofar as their audience is able to get anything out of their inspiration. This then is the reason why the lives of these practitioners of the inferior types of madness are ranked so low. For it is a common invective against poets and prophets in Plato that the practitioners of these arts understand nothing of which they speak, which is exactly what the philosopher avoids by resorting to recollection and rational argument. Thus, the philosopher comes out first in the ranking of lives, because he knows how to direct the techni, including rhetoric, and madness of the lesser lives to the common telos of recollecting the divine truths. Plato in the Phaedrus makes Socrates the paradigm of this type of philosopher, who receives both his divine sign, calls himself a mantis, styles himself as the poet Stesichorus, writes a rhetorical Antilogicae, and nevertheless expounds some of Plato's most central doctrines in the same speech, exactly because he understands how to use all these for the one right telos. This brings us to the third section of this essay, where I want to argue that in making his division of madness into four kinds to show the unity of their telos, Socrates puts his theory of synagoge, that is collection, and diaresis, that is division, into practice. This becomes clear when Socrates declares that the other things, by which he is presumably referring to the palinode, which he had just been talking about at length, were really just said in jest. And this is text 5 on the handout, where Socrates says, "Well, the other things really do appear to me to have been spoken in play, but some of them were given with fortune's guidance, and there were in them two kinds of things, the nature of which it would be quite wonderful to grasp by means of a systematic art." This passage obviously presents a problem. How can Socrates call his treatment of some of the most central ideas of Plato's philosophy in his second speech mere play? It is my contention that Socrates expresses himself so strongly here because he wants to emphasize that his restatement of these overly familiar doctrines is strictly a means to the end of describing his theory of diaresis. Thus, Socrates is here drawing our attention to the fact that he wants us to grasp two forms from his speech. These two forms refer to synagoge and diaresis, and the person who is able to use these concepts in speech is a dialectician whose characteristic it is to show that there is unity in plurality. As Socrates says in text 6 on the handout, the dialectician is capable of discerning a single thing that is also by nature capable of encompassing many. In other words, the method of diaresis means to order things that are divided into one single thing. That is, as Socrates says in text 7, it consists in seeing together things that are scattered about everywhere and collecting them into one kind, so that by understanding the parts of a concept, we can perceive its overall unity. This is exactly what Socrates found in the case of madness, which at first seemed to be composed of kinds different from one another, but were revealed to be unified through their teleological unity. Socrates then goes on to show that the same is true in the case of rhetoric. First, he makes this division by explaining that since there is such a plurality of souls, the rhetorician's task is to give a speech fitting to every single soul. This, of course, effectively renders rhetoric an impossible task. However, by understanding that all souls strive for the same telos, namely recollection of the truths it saw when it was with Zeus, the dialectician, as the true rhetorician, understands how to engage in psychagogia of all the individual souls by means of one form. This is text 8 on the handout. No one will ever possess the art of speaking to the extent that any human being can, unless he acquires the ability to enumerate the sorts of characters to be found in any audience, to divide everything according to its kinds, and to grasp each single thing firmly by means of one form. This passage bolsters the point I have been making thus far, that rhetoric and madness are used as means of showing by the application of the diaresis the main theme of the Phaedrus is the unity achieved by dialectics. The single overarching telos of the human soul is recollection of the divine truths that it was shown by Zeus, and the different techni, including poetry, rhetoric, and divination, are its chief means to this end. Thus, these techni are practiced correctly when they aid the soul in achieving its telos. However, because the practitioners of these techni are without philosophical training, They do not recognize that the soul has a single goal. Consequently, they need the dialectician to guide them, whose task it is through diaresis to make other people see unity where they mistakenly perceive plurality. My reading might raise the question what Plato meant with this notion, with his notion that the one telos of the human soul is some single form. We know from the application of diaresis in the Sophist that the forms stand in a kind of hierarchical relation to one another, where the highest good contains all the other forms in a unity. One answer might then be that unity is the one true telos of the soul because Plato identified unity with the good. This idea is suggested by Aristoxenus, who wrote that Plato thought that the good is one. For it makes sense that the god would want the human soul to converge all its actions in the single pursuit of recollecting goodness, as this is paramount to its improvement. Moreover, this reading resonates well with the picture that is offered in the Phaedrus, where the bringing things to a unity by diaresis is identified with anamnesis. This is text 9 on the handout. But a soul that never saw the truth cannot take a human shape, since a human being must understand speech in terms of general forms, proceeding to bring many perceptions together into a recent unity. That process is the recollection of the things our soul saw when it was traveling with God, when it disregarded the things we now call real and lifted up its head to what is truly real instead. Thus we are here told that when our souls were shown real being by the God prior to embodiment, it saw a unity, or one, brought together by reasoning. The testimony of Aristoxenus allows us to see that this recent unity is the very form of the good itself. This explains why Socrates says that he follows the dialectician as if he were a god, because the dialectician imitates God by showing the human soul that there is unity. In other words, the god was a kind of proto-dialectician who first showed the soul the unity of the forms, which is exactly what the dialectician through the diaresis and the synagogue does on a human scale. Thus the Phaedrus shows us not only that the telos of the human soul ought to be this one that is the good, but also that the dialectician, by means of this method of diaresis, can become like a god himself. In conclusion, I set out in this essay to explore the role of Mania in the Phaedrus and found that scholarship on the topic had been misled by focusing too narrowly on the relationship between Mania and Sophrosyne, which they assumed was paradoxical and antithetical. However, I have shown that there is no reason in the Phaedrus to suppose with these scholars that Plato was hostile to all kinds of Mania, nor with Nussbaum that the Phaedrus revises the attitude towards Mania that we find in the earlier dialogues. Instead, I propose that Socrates' division of Mania into 4 as an application of diaresis shows that the 4 types of madness are unified through their common telos. This common telos is the one, which Aristoxenus suggests is synonymous with the good for Plato, and it is the task of the dialectician to make the human soul see this unity through division and collection, where it was otherwise prone to perceive plurality. I further showed that in fact rhetoric and all the other techni share this unified telos with madness, so that, contrary to what scholars have usually thought, the dialogue itself. Thus the Phaedrus is neither fragmented or paradoxical, but contains a powerful vision of the Platonic doctrine of unity that shows how dialectics should guide the soul to see the seemingly different areas of rhetoric, love, and madness as all sharing the same telos, the one. And that was the end.
Thank you very much. That, yeah, silent, slightly awkward round of applause. Thank you. I found that really interesting, especially as it relates a lot to what I'm writing on at the moment. So that's always exciting. So as usual, if you'd like to ask a question, put your name in the chat bar. We'll give you a few minutes. Let's see if anyone. But whilst you are thinking of your questions, so this might be my my like research talking, but I was wondering about alcohol and madness. So I've been working at the moment on Heraclitus's idea of Bacchic madness and this idea of drunkenness, and I was wondering, would that come under mantic madness, and is alcohol consumption not a loss of self sound thinking.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that he gives 4 types of madness, and maybe telestic madness, which is the one related to Dionysus, would be the one that it comes under there. But that again, in the Phaedrus is quite clear that that's one of the lower types of madness. So I don't think he affords it the same role that Heraclitus does, maybe, because Heraclitus is skeptical of drunkenness, right?
Yes, Heraclitus is skeptical.
The wetter the soul is, the worse it is, right?
The less sound thinking it is, the wetter it is. Yeah. Well, he also talks in B15 about how it's shameful to perform Bacchic rituals if it's not for Dionysus. So he does also talk about this idea that this idea that a Bacchic frenzy is still appropriate in some contexts.
Yeah. There's in the Symposium, I actually don't think that Socrates is drunk. I think he's the one that sticks it out to the end, and he's not really as strong as all the others. So I think that if drunkenness would be a part of the types of madness in the Phaedrus, it would be part of the telestic madness, which is a part of Dionysus's type of madness, and that is a lower kind of madness where you would have to, on my argument, afterwards engage in recollection to remember what you were inspired to say. But that doesn't mean that actually, on my argument as well, getting really drunk and getting into mania is actually beneficial to your philosophical inquiry if you manage to get a contact with the divine.
Yeah, I mean, it would the loss of memory would completely fit with Heraclitus anyway. That you forget it, and then you can okay, thank you. And Andres, you will have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
So my research is also related to madness. I mean, I'm looking at history of medicine, and I'm looking at impaired consciousness. And I'm arguing that in the Hippocratic corpus, whenever they talk about mania, and they are actually not talking about madness as we now understand it as impaired consciousness, but as we now understand it as a mental illness, but as impaired consciousness. So, and I include also drunkenness as a kind of impaired consciousness. So my question would be, how would you characterize the mania that Plato describes? Maybe you said it, but I had a lot of trouble with the connection, so I might have missed a little bit. But how would you make a description of what mania is according to Plato? What are the symptoms, or what are the characteristics? If you...
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I didn't mention the Hippocratics, partly because I don't know too much about it, but that is definitely, on my thinking, why it's difficult for us to access what Plato meant by mania, in the sense that it doesn't mean mental illness. It's actually, and that's what I'm trying to argue here, is that mania in some form or not means that you have the God inside you. That's what I talked about with enthusiastikon and entheos. And that makes you potentially lose control of yourself. That is, your reason becomes clouded and you're not able to think straight. But what comes out of your mouth is directly the words of the god. That is to say that if Pythia speaks something, if you ask Pythia a question, her response will literally be Apollo's voice. And I think that Plato shares this instinct completely. He's very traditional in that regard. And that's why I think we can't just get rid of madness and saying that. It's one of the scholars I dealt with here, I can't remember which, I think he was Werner, he's called. He said that Plato here describes some sort of rational madness where you're possessed by the forms, which is completely nonsensical, because the forms do not have agency. They cannot mix with you. So actually, madness on Plato's account is very traditional. It's simply the god speaking through you, but it clouds your judgment, and that's what's dangerous about it. But as this Phaedrus says on my account, you can, if you engage dialectically, and also have other people help you remember through anamnesis what it is you're inspired to say, you can actually directly get an insight and know the divine. And that's obviously the great part of, or the great project of Plato's philosophy, is knowing the divine in some form or other. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's not a
Yeah, it does.
it's not
It actually
possession,
fits.
or it's not mental illness, as you say. Yeah, that's right.
Well, yeah, it actually fits more with the idea of impaired consciousness, of like this sudden loss of rational capacities of memory and acting weird or bizarre. So good.
So, I mean, so are we saying then that impaired consciousness is acceptable insofar as it achieves a greater connection with the divine?
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say, and I think not everyone shares my instinct in this, but I think it's quite clear that whatever the God, if you have Plato's theology and the God has to be good in everything the God does, it simply does not make sense for mania to be a bad thing. It wouldn't be a sense for someone to be entheos and that be bad for them. I mean, your attitude to the content revealed to you might be wrong, as in you might not engage dialectically with it, but that doesn't take away from that the thing you are inspired to say will always be knowledge, and knowledge of the highest kind.
Any more questions? Okay. I'll have to think of another. I mean, I have loads. I'm just No, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I'm really tired today. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. It is a weird paper, and I mean, if I can say something myself, that I don't know if I actually make a bit of a logical slip at some point in the paper, because my argument at the end bit, and that is confusing, and I didn't portray that very well, is that through the process of division, collection and division, the aim of everything, the aim of rhetoric, the aim of poetry, the aim of everything becomes this one. But just because you aim all your aspirations, philosophical aspirations, at one aspect, that doesn't mean that the object you're aiming for is then one, literally, that it is it's the number one, which is what I'm arguing. So I don't know whether there are any
Yeah,
thoughts
you
on
mean
that.
it could be numerically one, but not
but not the one.
But not the one.
Not one with a capital O.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I get, but then you have the problem in the sophist, which is how can you have one thing? Surely one and numerically one have to be the same, because otherwise you have a multiplicity in terms. So,
yeah, that's a good
Ethan.
point.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Jacob, I was wondering, are there different, and I guess it's part of a question, a couple questions are already asked were, I guess, speaking, like, what is the nature of madness, or this, like, sort of enthused state, as such, that can we think of it as, for instance, drunkenness or mental illness and whatnot? And yeah, I was wondering if even in Plato, there are different states of being enthused, because, for instance, like in the Ion, the poet or the rhetor that is enthumos is, I mean, again, there's a huge debate on this, and like, is it ironical or not? If it is irony, what is exactly Socrates' attitude to this? But I think in the Ion, it is clearly I think it's clearly something disparaging. At least the Ion's inability to give a clear account of what exactly is happening in himself, I think, is spoken of sort of disparagingly. And whereas at the end of Meno, at least the virtue in terms of as political excellence is ultimately attributed to Theia Moira, the divine dispensation. And so there, I think it's more ambiguous, if not positive. But yeah, do you have thoughts on either different kinds or states of mania, or just state of enthumos, when we have sort of varying, like Plato's ambiguous attitude in his different dialogues?
Yeah, I think I would say that in the cases you mentioned, there are some pretty grim passages in the Republic, for example, where he says that, oh, madness is a horrible thing, and you should never do that, and it will impede your philosophical career. But I would say that, again, that's not the content of madness, which is divine and which is good. It's your attitude to it. And the danger is with all of these mantes going around. You see it in Euthyphro, you see it in Ion. They're kind of like the epitome of that kind of mantis character that practices manteia for all the wrong reasons. And actually, there's an interesting bit at the very, very end of the Ion. It's actually the very last line said by Socrates. Socrates says, then you may count on this nobler title in our minds, Ion, of being divine and not an artistic praiser of Homer. I think that sums it up, and I think that's very little recognized about the Ion, is that Socrates says at the end, well, you shouldn't, all that about going around from city to city and reciting Homer. I mean, that's all good and jolly, but for God's sake, Ion, you're divine, you're theos, and that means something. That means that you have a direct access to the divine, and that's what you should use to better your life, instead of just, engaging in these heuristic competitions about who can recite Homer best. So I think that, and that's really what Plato wants to bring forward in the Phaedrus. He wants to say, I'm not all that against Mania. It might seem like I am in the dialogues, because I'm against Mentes as a kind of social group in society, because they they have no idea what they're doing, because they don't, Plato's all about improving your individual soul, and they don't do that. They just say things they don't even understand, as he says in the Ion.
So I guess, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I was done.
Oh no, so I guess the other question is like, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's fairly clear that for Plato, God is has to be inherently good, and so he cannot sort of cause, like, he cannot be the aitia for anything bad, and so I guess what I'm sort of trying to work out is, for instance, in this problematic Mentates case of like the Ion, how can, I mean, his state of enthymos is clearly like the divine has some cause, but the negative side of that is obviously we cannot attribute it to the divine, and so I guess like how can the divine, how can God even lend himself to be used, or to be sort of embodied or mentated by these people in a problematic way, if I mean, because he's surely something more than like a neutral inherently good tool, if you know what I mean, that in the hands of these problematic people can be used wrongly, as it were. But
I think maybe your question is demanding a theodicy that's more advanced than where Plato was at. I don't think Plato would necessarily see a problem with someone like Dionysus or Eros jumping into someone and potentially making a bit of fun and inspiring them to. Yeah, but then again, I think you're right that, again, he does say that the gods only do good. So how can he possess someone and that has bad aspects? I would again say that it's on you. It's on you as an individual where the fault lies. It's never with the god. It's always your attitude to it.
Is it possible to behave to use? Is it possible to have kind of a bad use of madness on the path to a kind of a complete understanding? In the sense you could use this you could have a god that creates a kind of a problematic madness, but because it's still ultimately bringing you closer to this goal, it's still positive in general.
I think that, for example, like the daimonion, the Socrates divine sign, is a bit like an example of that. I know that that's not directly a case of mantis, but Socrates does say in the Phaedrus actually that he is a mantis because he receives his daimonion semeion. And if you just take that as an example, I mean, Socrates derives some of his crucial sort of commitments, philosophical commitments in life from that experience, and that is, as you say, it leads him forward. And that doesn't mean that, for example, the Euthydemus starts by Socrates getting up he's in the changing room somewhere, and he gets up, and the daimonion comes and says no, and he sits down again, and then you're left to wonder as a reader. I mean, where's all the benefit here? This is directly mandated by God that Socrates is supposed to sit down. But I think that it's one of these things where the task is then on Socrates to figure out why was it important that I had the discussion with Euthydemus and the other sophists in that dialogue. So I think we're really to think always, even though it might seem strange at the moment, that there is some sense in which this divine, I don't know if revelation is a strong word, but that is
Exposure.
That is good for you in some way. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's I think it must be positive always, in some sense.
Well, if God is good, it's always going to be positive in some respect. Okay, well, we'll conclude questions there. If you have anything else, people can add them to the blog. We'll take about a break until about 20 past, and then Sophia will present her paper.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for that paper. It was really interesting. And thank you, Albert, for the clap. Actually, I mean, if you don't need a break, that you can also go. I mean, time is a social construct.
What are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can. I need to start sharing my screen.
In the meantime, who's here? Who are the if anyone? Oh yeah, okay, you're right. We definitely need a break. Thanks, Nir.
Wait, being serious.
No, we'll wait until 20 past.
Okay.
Just in case anyone needs a wee break or something.
Sorry, how do I share my background, my thing?
You can screen share in the bottom left corner. It says share your screen. It may or may not work. It didn't work when Sarah did it, but it did when Thomas did it. So we have a sort of a 50% success rate.
Speaking voice muted.
If you need us to see something, you can...
Huh?
I couldn't get my screen share to work on the one I was actually trying to talk into, so I had a separate thing.
Okay. When you did your paper, did you read it off a script and then have your video?
Well, ish, yes.
Okay, because I couldn't work out what the best way to do it was, but if I'm sharing my screen, then I can't have my notes on it. So.
Yes, that was the problem. I had some slightly weird notes written down the bottom of my presentation last time, which were all visible.
Exactly, that's what I didn't want to repeat. So yeah, I should be able to read it and do scrolling at the same time, hopefully.
You need a second monitor.
Do you have a second?
This angle, Joe.
Why do I feel like you have a second monitor, Joe?
Sure.
Do you have like a kind of a full office setup where you can?
I wouldn't say it's full, but it works. Yeah.
It works. Well, that's kind of all we can hope for all these days. Functional.
I'm gonna try.
It's useful if you're trying to share one screen and then like messing around on the other with students or something. I've found for teaching.
So me currently clicking share your screen is doing nothing at all.
Well, are you showing us pictures? Because you could send more pictures. Are you showing images? Why don't you send them as an email and then we can access them separately? Is that?
I don't think that will work because there's about 40 pictures. But why is that not doing? Well, I'll come back.
Okay.
This what is it, Jitsi? It doesn't seem to quite do the streaming so well, the screen sharing thing.
No. It doesn't. However, we don't actually have a Zoom account, so the alternative is, I mean, I
have
suppose
a Zoom.
Google.
The faculty gave me a Zoom.
You have a
account.
Zoom. Oh, because you have a GTA Zoom.
Yeah,
Yeah, didn't they give all the GTAs Zoom accounts, but refused to give?
they must. I think we were just first.
Yeah, we might. Can we do that? Because I keep pressing share screen and it's really not doing anything.
You want to do a Zoom?
Well, I don't know how to do it if I'm not.
Okay. We
If
could
you want to, I
do.
can put-
Let me. Yeah. Could you set up a Zoom and send it in the chat, and then we can all.
If you give me 2 minutes, I will do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I will end this recording then.
Wait.
Well,
Yeah, no,
we don't want to.
that's very weird.
Yes.
Hmm.